In the Bible, there's heaven and there's earth. There's God's space, and then there's our space, to put it simply. That's how the Bible begins. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Literally, God created the land and the skies. We know what earth looks like. We know what the land looks like. It looks like trees and grass and dirt and roots and everything else. But usually when we hear about heaven, or in Genesis 1:1, when we read about the heavens, the picture might be a little fuzzier. We might think of gold, harps, angels, grapes. I don't know what you might think of heaven as being like. But that picture's a little fuzzier. But maybe it helps to think of the land and the skies. Now the point of that is, at least in Genesis 1:1, part of it is to say that the land and the skies are two separate things, right? The land's down here, the sky is up there. They're two different things. But of course, they're always in contact. There's no way that you can have the sky without it being in touch with the land, and vice versa. And that's really what the biblical story, in some ways, is all about. There's a tradition in Celtic Christianity that I find really interesting, and the idea is that heaven and earth are always 3 feet apart. So I guess 1, 2, 3, something like this. Heaven and earth are always 3 feet apart. But part of the tradition is that there are specific parts of the world where that gap is closer, where heaven and earth are less than 3 feet apart. And those places are called thin places, places where heaven and earth are closer than they normally might be. Now, in the Bible, in the beginning, heaven and earth, we might say, are one. God's walking with his people in Eden, and the world is as it should be. The humans are partnering with God in order to bring about a flourishing planet. So that's how it's supposed to be, but then, as you probably know, we choose to do things our way. We humans choose to set up our own alternate way of doing things. And what that ends up looking like in Genesis chapter 3 is God driving out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. So what was heaven and earth combined in one space, overlapping over each other, now is separated. God's space and human space have become two. The humans have been driven out from the garden. So now we have these two separate spaces. And what we're going to do tonight is to trace this idea, beginning as we have in Genesis and going through at least some of the rest of the Bible, to trace the idea of the story of the Bible being cast in one way, which is God bringing back together these two separate spaces, that heaven and earth have been separated from each other, and that throughout the Bible, God is working to bring them back together. Now, in the way that you and I experience the world right now, you might probably experience the world more as, let's say, more like, earth than heaven. Earth is sometimes tough, sometimes rough on us. So you probably experience these two spaces as separate. But in the biblical story, there is a place where humans can go to experience these two spaces being one. And those places are called temples. And hopefully you can see in the center here where they're united, there's a little temple there, because that's the function that temples serve in the Bible. That a human could go to this place, first the tabernacle, which is a big tent, and then second to this massive permanent structure called the temple. And in that place, heaven and earth are overlapping. They're reunited the way that they were always supposed to be, the way that they were in the Garden of Eden. And you can see this, among other ways, the fact that the temple is explicitly decorated to mimic the Garden of Eden. One example of this is 1 Kings 6, verse 29, which says, "Around all the walls of the house, the temple, he carved engraved figures of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers." So it's specifically mimicking the garden to say that just like in the garden where heaven and earth are united, so in the tabernacle, so in the temple, heaven and earth are coming together as one. But there's a problem with this, because when heaven and earth come together, things can get tricky, right? Because in heaven, you have God and his presence, his goodness, his beauty, his justice, everything that's right about God. And then on earth, we have some good stuff, but we also have some really bad stuff, right? We have a lot of ugliness and sin and injustice that abounds in our world as we mistreat each other. So those two spaces can kind of be like oil and water, not exactly mixing well together. And you can see this in the Bible, for instance, in Exodus chapter 40, which says that the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So, presence of God there in the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. This is true also of the temple. We won't read that, but it's on the screen. So when God's space comes into the tabernacle, into the temple, when God's presence comes in, it becomes God's space. Human space is kind of cast out, right? Because those two don't mix well together. So we have a problem here. Now, if you're an Israelite, imagine that you are an ancient Israelite, and you're walking into the tabernacle area, and you're bringing an offering, as they used to do. What would you see? When you walk into the tabernacle complex, maybe the first thing you would notice, right in front of you, there's an altar with fire that never goes out, fire that is just perpetually burning on this altar. So that's interesting. But maybe the second thing you notice as you make your way around the altar is that right at the door of the tabernacle, the entrance of the tabernacle is blocked by a curtain. And on that curtain, there are two cherubim guarding the entrance to the tabernacle. Now, if you remember what we read a couple minutes ago from Genesis chapter 3, there are cherubim placed at the entrance to the garden after the humans are cast out. So this cherubim placement at the entrance to the tabernacle is an intentional callback to that, to say, just like the humans have been separated from God in the Garden of Eden, so now in the tabernacle and in the temple, the cherubim are separating humans from their God. Now this I don't know, maybe sits unwell with you. Maybe it sounds unfair, but we'll talk in just a moment about why this is the case. And in Leviticus, the book of the Bible that maybe you give up if you haven't already in your annual Bible reading goals, Leviticus is sometimes feels dry. But when you understand what's going on in Leviticus, to me, it's one of the most interesting books in the Bible, because really it's all about holiness. It's about answering this dilemma of how can we combine these two spaces. It's about holiness. Now, you and I probably don't use the word holy very often, at least outside of this building. But to be holy is really simple. For something or someone to be holy just means that it's set apart to be in God's presence, to function for God. Now, in the Bible, you have, for instance, a bowl called holy, just, a bowl that you eat out of called holy, because it's set apart to be used in service to God. So this bowl is holy because it's functioning in God's presence. So that's what it means to be holy. You have to fit these specific dimensions. If you read Leviticus, there are a lot of things, there are a lot of boxes you have to check in order to be holy. And the reason for that is because the God of Israel is dangerous. Now, this is interesting because this is not necessarily a side of God that we are the most comfortable with. But when you read Leviticus, you see that God is in some ways dangerous. For instance, when the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies, which is the center of God's presence on earth, the place more than anywhere else where heaven is overlapping with earth. And once a year, the high priest can go into that room and be with God's presence in this special way. But when the high priest was going in there, it was a high-risk position because they had to tie a rope around his ankle in order to drag him out, because there was a solid chance when he went into the Holy of Holies, he wasn't coming back out alive. That's how serious it was, how dangerous it was to go into the presence of this God. They had to have this rope in order to drag him out. And I think of, for instance, the sun. I think of it as being like the sun, where the sun is good, right? We need the sun. The sun gives us life. If we don't have the sun, well, first of all, we get down in our mood, and if we don't have it for long enough, we're not going to make it, right? The sun is really important to us as humans. But it's also dangerous to us, because if we're out in it too long, well, we need sunscreen, we need long sleeves, we need a hat, and if you're going to try to get much closer to the sun, you better have fancy gear on and all that kind of stuff, right? So the sun is good, but it's also dangerous. And that doesn't make it bad. It's just what the sun is. It's just the sun. So we have to work around it instead of it around us. It's just pure power and energy. And I think that might help, at least it helps me, to grasp something of what God in Leviticus is all about. That it's not that this God is bad, but it is that to some extent this God is dangerous. To come into his presence, we have to be holy. One more example that helps me to think about it. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, Aslan is the lion, and in the book, if I remember correctly, the lion represents God. And Susan is a character in the book, is about to meet Aslan. And Mr. Beaver, another character, I know there's a lot going on, but Mr. Beaver is introducing Aslan as a lion, he says. And now Susan doesn't realize until now that she's about to meet a lion. She thought Aslan was a human person, and now she's finding out, oh boy, I'm about to meet a lion face to face. And so she says, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? Is her question. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. And Mr. Beaver's response, he says, safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. Now that's interesting to me. Of course he isn't safe, right? He's a lion in this case, but he's good. And that's the God of Leviticus. He's good. He is holy. He's everything that we should be, but it doesn't mean that he's safe. There's something dangerous about this God. In order to be in his presence, we must be holy. And in order for us to become holy, in the logic of the Bible, we have to atone for sin. Now, atonement, again, not a word that we use outside of this very room, right? But it's pretty simple what it means. It's just in the word itself. To atone, to put at one. That's how you spell atonement, and it's what it means. To bring back together two things that have been separated, something that's been broken. To atone is to fix that, to bring it back together. And in Leviticus, what atones for our sin is the sacrifice of animals. This is Leviticus 17:11. The life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life. Now there's a lot going on here, but the basic idea, it seems, is that somehow in the blood of these animals that are sacrificed to God, that blood, that life that is spilled, atones for the sin, for the rupture that's been brought about by our sin. If you're the ancient Israelite, by your sin, it atones for that. It brings you back together symbolically with God so you can enter into the presence of God. Now, to us, that's probably weird. I don't know about you. I've never seen an animal sacrificed in real life, and I really don't want to see that. But this is not all that uncommon for their culture. Lots of ancient cultures had the custom of sacrificing to appease the gods. But here's what's interesting about this. If you read this again in Leviticus 17, notice that this sacrifice is not just from people to God. Notice what it says. I have given it for you. Now that's backwards. If you are bringing your animal to sacrifice to your God, that's a gift from you to God, right? But not according to this logic. The logic here is that this is God's gift to you and to me. And I think the point is that this animal, I think the point is partially that this doesn't make sense. The point is that the life of this innocent animal should not allow me to come into the presence of God. I'm the one who did wrong, right? You're the one who did wrong. So why am I allowed to come into the presence of God because of this animal? It's not necessarily fair, but it's good. It's a gift. It's grace from God. I think that's the logic here, that this gift from God can bring about atonement for us and bring us back together with God, with each other. It can bring heaven and earth back together. And you can see this, among other places, in chapter 16, where it talks about this sin offering making atonement for himself and for his house. Now, I know we're reading a lot of texts from kind of all around the Old Testament tonight, so hang on with me. I promise we're going to get to some more application in just a moment. But I want to hold on to all of those ideas and jump to the New Testament. Thinking about atonement, thinking about sacrifice, thinking about the temple and tabernacle and heaven and earth and God's space and human space. Let's read John 1 verse 14. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now this Word is God made flesh. We know him as Jesus. This Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Now this word dwelt, you might have heard, but if so, a reminder, it's literally that he pitched his tent. He tabernacled among us. So Jesus went camping among us in a human body is the point. But for John, part of what he seems to be saying is Jesus is the human embodiment of the Old Testament tabernacle, the Old Testament temple. Jesus pitched his tent among us, full of, you remember the language that we read from Exodus, from 1 Kings, about full of glory. He's full of the glory of God. So he's on earth, and he is now becoming, for John, he has become the temple. He's become the embodiment where heaven and earth come together once more. So we could put, if we had a picture of Jesus, we could put him right in the middle there, where heaven and earth are coming together in him. The divinity and the humanity of Jesus joined together in this one human person and divine person. But here's what's really fascinating about Jesus, given all that we've talked about, given the fact that in Leviticus, there are all these boxes you have to check, and even if you check all of them, you better keep that rope tight around your ankle, right? That dangerous God. But here's Jesus, God in the flesh, and he's walking around as though he were none the wiser. Just for one example, Matthew chapter 9, verses 10 and 11. Jesus reclines at table in the house, and behold, many tax collectors and sinners, unholy people. Many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with him and his disciples. And this is weird enough that when the Pharisees see it, they say to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" So Jesus doesn't stay in a safe, clean, holy space in the same way. And he does this all the time. He goes out of his way to hang out with tax collectors, with sinners, with people who respectable people don't hang out with. He seeks them out, and he gives his life in the end for them, right? He said, I've come not to save the righteous, but sinners. I came to be with these unholy people. So Jesus goes out of his way doing this. And if we can put it like this, he's basically creating little pockets of heaven on earth. When people interact with him, they are interacting with God, right? God in flesh. But they're also interacting with a human. He is in flesh. So he is heaven and earth as one. He is God's space and human space combined together as one. So he's a living and breathing and walking temple. And he's right in the midst of all this dirty, rotten, nasty human space, right? He is the temple, and he's hanging out with you and me, with broken people. Now, that's maybe not what God is supposed to be like, if we could put it like that, at least according to the Pharisees. That's not what God was supposed to be like. It didn't fit their categories, and Jesus made a lot of enemies because of it. And you know the story that so many people are thinking about today, where Jesus has this conspiracy, a plot, and a murder that eventually happened against him. And it seems in that moment like this plan to reunite heaven and earth is done. Because the one who's going around with this little pocket of heaven is done. He's dead and he's gone. But in that moment, we have to revisit earlier on in the story, back to John chapter 1, where John sees Jesus coming toward him, and he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." Now, having read the Old Testament, you and I know something of the imagery that's going on there. Maybe you haven't read the whole Old Testament, but reading a few of the verses that we read tonight, you get at least a picture of what's going on there, that the altar is the cross is the altar on which Jesus is being sacrificed to atone for the sins of the whole world, the sins of you and me, to atone, to bring back together heaven and earth, us and God. So Jesus takes away the sins of the world. The preacher of Hebrews puts it a bit more eloquently than I definitely can. He says, Christ entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? So it's this idea that Jesus is the sacrifice. The sacrifice that the Old Testament demanded for them to enter into God's presence. Jesus becomes the ultimate sacrifice. And in 1 Peter, Peter says that Christ suffered once for sins. And maybe the implication would be no one else needs ever to suffer again. No other animal needs to suffer like they did under the Old Covenant, because Jesus has done it. He's taken away our sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God. So we are ritually pure in him. We can enter into this sacred space. But more than that, and maybe this is the crux of what we talk about tonight, more than just being able to enter into the sacred space, Jesus enables that sacred space to enter into us. More than only being allowed to enter into the tabernacle. According to Paul, by inspiration, do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? So not only can we enter into sacred space, but we become sacred space. You and I become walking, breathing, living temples like Jesus himself. I want to share with you, as we close tonight, something of the story of this place, which is called Biosphere 2. Now, Biosphere 2 is in the middle of an Arizona desert, and originally, I think there's something about rebooting it, but originally, in the early 1990s, this was built by a bunch of scientists, and you can see the inside of one of these domes. The purpose of it was to create this beautiful, perfect, sealed-off version of Earth on Earth. So they have something of an ocean in there, salt water, all that stuff. They have wildernesses, they have forests, they have all kinds of different terrain, all under this one roof. It's the whole world inside of this dome. So it was an experiment. What would happen if we built the whole world inside of this dome? How would it work? And so they did all this, and some people went and lived inside of it to test it out. And at first it worked, but it didn't last. Otherwise, you and I probably would have heard of it. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we would be living in one of these by now if it had worked out. But it didn't. Oxygen was failing, and for probably most of us, our nightmares came true, and the population of ants and cockroaches exploded. So like a ton of ants and cockroaches and a bunch of other animals and critters that you might like more failed to exist in the end. And so it was really a terrifying place. They had to unseal Biosphere 2 and let the outside world into the biosphere, and the people had to go out and live somewhere else. So that's a long story short. But I'm presenting it to you as kind of a model of the Garden of Eden, in the sense that it was supposed to be this beautiful, tranquil place where humans could exist in harmony with nature. And of course, we would add, in terms of Eden, in harmony with God. But much like Eden, this place becomes imperfect because we are imperfect. Because this world is broken, because we are broken, and we're populating this broken planet. But the thing about Israel's God, the thing about our God, is that he doesn't give up on thin places. Those places where heaven and earth are closer together than they are in other places, because God is everywhere, right? We would say that God is omnipresent. He's everywhere. But maybe in a special sense, God is in you and me, that we are temples of God, that we are, to borrow from the tradition, thin places, that we are called to be little walking, breathing biospheres of heaven on earth, so that when I walk into school, when I walk into work, when I walk into my front door, when I walk into here, when I walk into the grocery store, that I'm bringing healing, that I'm bringing atonement, bringing the presence of God, the beauty, the goodness, the justice, the righteousness of God, the forgiveness that God has shown to me, that I'm bringing it to the world. So that's my challenge to you. A challenge and reminder that you are a thin place on earth. That if you are a baptized believer, you have God's Spirit dwelling within you. You are a walking, living, breathing temple. You're a thin place here on earth. And you are called to live into that identity. Not just to know that you are a temple, but to act like it. To act like you are holy. To act like you are kind, that you're good, you're gracious, you're forgiven, and you're forgiving. That you are becoming like Jesus every single day. So that's my call to you, a reminder and challenge to you and to me as we go throughout this week that will be thin places in whatever places that we find ourselves that maybe have just a little bit too much earth, that we could bring heaven to that spot as well. Tonight, if you need to begin your walk with Christ, won't you do it as we stand and sing together?